but also through every major water system. There was bans on drinking water, there were bans on swimming, there were bans on fishing, there were bans across the board. And part of this was then citizens looking in the 1960s and early 1970s on how we move towards public support. So the work that you're doing is indispensable at keeping this focus on what those people were doing in the 1960s, on looking at how we understand the pressures facing our water systems. So next slide. Within that, one of the things that was created now 46 years ago was really unique, and I think it just reminds us of what a leader Canada was in science. And one of the areas of that leadership was that a group of scientists, Jim Bruce was one, David Schindler was another, they just, I think, often with this really wonderful spirit of pioneering, I don't think they told anybody in Ottawa what they were doing, to be honest. But they decided that in order to try to understand some of the pressures that you saw from the previous slide, there was a need for work on looking at dynamics of contaminants and pollution, which expanded beyond laboratories and test tubes. And so what they had the vision of doing was to set aside a pristine area of 27,000 hectares and comprised of 58 lakes, right on the border, just about an hour outside of Kenora, on the border of Ontario and Manitoba, and set up what they called the Experimental Lakes Area. And what that did was then over that period, and next slide, I'll just give you some examples of the work that they've done. So one of those is the work in Lake 226. So the scientists that are there are about 26 full-time staff, and then another in the summer, we have an influx of about 50 people. And one of the stories that the chief scientist, Mike Patterson, told me was that they within the literature of limnology, Lake 226 is sort of viewed as being a sacred place. And they had a researcher from Japan that came and said when he saw this lake, I can now retire happily because I've seen Lake 226. So I'm an economist, but I just want to go ahead and share with you that within culture of people of lake scientists and water scientists, this is really a big deal. And the reason it's a big deal is because in this lake was the place where we understood what we now take for granted, which is understood the impacts of phosphorus contamination on our freshwater bodies. And in the 1960s, phosphorus was used in everything. It was used on cleaning, detergents, and others. The work that they did in controlled experiments on providing daily input of phosphorus into Lake 226, as well as what they did with this really innovative way in which you cut off the lake into these two sections. Before this, people didn't understand why lakes were turning green. So they observed it, but there was no science to say why was this happening. So after this experiment and the literature that's come out of this, and there's been over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers that have been produced from the Experimental Lakes area over the last 45 years. Out of this work, United States, Canada, the European Union, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, all moved in the 1970s to restrict how phosphorus can be used. So that was one sort of real-world example where it's changed our lives for the better. That lake continues to this day. So every single day, scientists will go out and they'll insert phosphorus into the lake, and therefore this is also, in addition to what it's done historically, among the longest-serving continuous databases in the world. So this is now coming up on 47 years of continuous, uninterrupted, controlled data on looking at what phosphorus is doing to this lake. So that would be one example of what they're doing. And the next slide would be, sorry. And then the other one is the work that they've done in acid rain, again, in the 1980s. They looked at controlled impacts of NOx and SOx, of the elements of precursors of acid rain. And I began my career working with in Environment Canada with our previous minister, Charles Katcha. And in 1984, nobody really understood acid rain. I remember Mr. Katcha, for those of you that may have known him, he used to sort of look and say, we have to do more. and it was very unclear, it was less than clear about whether you can make a causal link between those emissions from those sources and then impacts on lakes and forests. So again, next slide, the work that scientists in ELA, among what they did, was look at what the impacts are of acidified fish as opposed to healthy fish, and that's sort of a dramatic visual representation of some of the work that they've done. So, next slide, please.
Wait.
Please, yeah.
So what's the status of acid rain nowadays? We don't hear about it much anymore.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that there are probably people here that would know. I think that many of the governments, Canada being one, introduced scrubbers, mandatory scrubbers, to filter out SO2 emissions. And every year, Canada and the United States, under a treaty, Canada and the United States report on acid, those emissions, which are precursors to acid rain.
Right.
And I think the last time I looked was about 2.5 years ago, and what they've said is that acid rain-related problems in central Canada have reduced dramatically, but at the same time, emissions from NOx and SOx in Western Canada, pre-commodity price collapse in Fort McMurray, were the largest single growing source of NOx and SOx as well as greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, and that you're seeing now observed impacts of acid rain-like symptoms in northern Manitoba, northern Saskatchewan, and lower parts of Northwest Territories, where you're seeing acidification of lakes and destruction of forests in those areas. So that's based on Environment Canada analysis from under their annual obligations to provide reporting.
So they don't have scrubbers out there? Is that what
They do have scrubbers, but it's just a total, absolutely. All the scrubbers that are in Fort McMurray and in Calgary and all the refineries, they absolutely do, but it's the scale of those emissions have just increased by so much. And then there's also a question, which is, which I don't have a clear answer to, which is on what are the contaminants which are included in flaring. And so the flaring that you'll see at these refineries, there's questions about what the breakdown of that is. So that would be one. The other one is mercury, and so mercury is there's many different sources of mercury. There's now a new UN convention that's been agreed to 2 or 3 years ago at global level. But among the work that scientific colleagues in experimental lakes are doing is looking at what are the naturally occurring sources of mercury, as well as then additional sources. So one would be from coal-fired plants, for example. And so this is a very simple graph of the dynamics of mercury. And then the second slide would be what they've done.
Sorry. Can I just go back so she can get a picture of that?
Get a picture of your graphic. Would that be okay?
Sure, of course.
It's just very
Absolutely.
helpful. Thank you.
And I could leave this PowerPoint with you as well.
That would be great.
Bless
That'd be
you.
great.
That's great.
So again, what they've done in experimental lakes is provide controlled inputs of mercury contaminants into one of the lakes. And it's important to say in these lakes, among the reasons that Schindler and others chose this, it's in the boreal region. There's virtually no groundwater. So there's no sort of leaching. So what you have is the ability to do within this a sort of highly controlled experiment in terms of what the dynamics are with mercury. And so they've done both aerial as well as then dropping in by hand mercury, very tiny amounts of mercury, which basically mirror naturally occurring background rates coming from coal-fired plants. And in order then to better understand the impacts, particularly on the fisheries within the experimental lakes area. So that would be, this is not an historical issue, this is still a current real world issue. So
Scott, would they use this lake and compare it to another lake that's pristine?
So exactly, yeah. So it's a great question. So among the 58 lakes, they will have a number of reference lakes, which have remained untouched for 47 years. And so for each one of the lakes in which they're doing the experiments, and at any given time, there's probably 10 lakes which they will look at what is the relation to the reference lake. And then aside from the lake 226 on the phosphorus, the others they'll look at what would be the recovery rates when you actually leave this alone after several years, And so for mercury, what they found is that the recovery rates were faster than what they had expected in reference then to the reference rate.